The whip hung above Salt Wells, and not one man in that crowd moved to stop it. Aya Tanabe knelt in the dust with her dead husband's debt carved across a ledger she'd never been allowed to see, and a sheriff who counted every coin he didn't deserve. Then a rancher who hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 years walked through that crowd, set his hand on her shoulder, and said 2 words that changed everything. He didn't know her name, and she didn't know his, but by the time the sheriff understood what he'd let loose, a whole town would have to decide what honor was worth. Stay until the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways of Japan brought a corrupt frontier town to its knees without once raising her voice. The sun sat low and mean over Salt Wells that afternoon, turning the main street into a ribbon of white dust and broken promises. It was the kind of town that existed because someone had been too tired to go any further. 3 saloons, 2 general stores, a sheriff's office with a crooked star nailed above the door, and not one honest man in a position to do anything about it. The crowd had gathered slow, the way crowds do when the thing they came to watch is shameful, but not shameful enough to miss. Nobody said it out loud. They called her the Japanese woman. No one in Salt Wells had bothered to learn her name in the 2 years since she'd arrived with her husband, and now that he was in the ground, they weren't going to start. Aya Tanabe knelt in the dirt at the center of the square with her hands bound in front of her and a lacquered wooden box clutched against her ribs, like a child she was afraid someone would take. The box was wrong for this place, small and dark and polished, the kind of object that belonged on a shelf in a house far from here, and it drew every eye in the crowd more than the woman holding it did. Sheriff Cole Marston stood on the mercantile porch and read from a ledger in a voice built for crowds, slow and pleased with itself. He laid out the debt her dead husband Kinji owed the town for goods received and a land lease never paid, a sum that grew as he spoke, padded with fees and interest and storage costs that had no root in any honest record. Lawful seizure, he called it. The debt passed to the widow, he said, and so did the labor to pay it, until every coin was settled or until her body gave out trying. The law in the territory was whatever the man with the star said it was, and Cole Marston had been saying it for 6 years. The crowd did what crowds do in towns like Salt Wells. A few men near the back laughed, the dull, cruel kind that comes from feeling safe, and a woman turned her head so she wouldn't have to see. The storekeeper counted coin in his palm and didn't look up, and most of the rest just watched with their boots shifting in the dust, telling themselves it wasn't their business and believing it because it was easier than the alternative. Their silence did the work the sheriff needed done. Aya didn't beg. She knelt with her back straight and her breathing even, and anyone watching closely would have seen that her hands were steady and her eyes were fixed on a point past the crowd, past the rooftops, past anything they could touch. It was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome, the kind no frontier man recognized because it had nothing to do with toughness. She asked one question, quiet enough that the front row had to lean in to hear it, and the question was to see the ledger, the original one, the pages in her husband's hand. The sheriff didn't answer her cleanly. He turned the page and kept reading. A deputy brought the whip out from the sheriff's office, coiled and heavy, and the sound it made uncoiling ran through the crowd like a current. The sheriff counted the strokes she owed out loud, and the number was high enough that the laughing in the back stopped cold, because a man who'd come to watch a show was realizing he'd come to watch a killing. The count would kill her. Aya's grip on the box tightened until the lacquered wood pressed a line across her palms, and she didn't close her eyes. 12 seconds was what she had. 12 seconds between the sheriff's hand going up and the whip coming down. And the crowd had already decided those seconds belonged to him. She had asked for the ledger and been refused, and she had asked for the law and been handed a strap. And there was nothing left to ask for, and she wasn't going to ask again. Then a shadow crossed the mouth of the square, moving against the crowd the way a stone moves against a current, and every head that had been watching the whip turned to watch it instead. Someone had finally moved. No one in Salt Wells had seen Ezra Dalton in 3 years. He kept a ranch on the ridge north of town, 40 acres of scrub and dry creek, and a cabin he'd built with his own hands. And he came down for supplies twice a year and spoke to no one he didn't have to. The town had mostly forgotten he existed, which was the way he'd wanted it. And the ones who remembered him remembered a man who'd gone quiet after something bad and never come back from it. He walked through the crowd the way he walked through everything, without hurry and without apology. His boots loud on the packed dirt, and a rifle slung flat across his back that he made no move toward. He was tall and lean in the way that spoke of years of work rather than hunger. His face weathered past its age, his eyes the flat gray of creek stones. Nobody remembered the sound of his voice. Past the barber shop, past the hitching posts, past the corner of the mercantile he tracked, and then his gaze locked on the woman in the dirt and didn't move again. The whip was already coming down when his hand caught it, mid-arc, the leather biting into his palm hard enough to draw blood, and the crack of it stopping sounded louder than the crack of it falling would have. The crowd went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet all afternoon, and the deputy holding the handle stumbled forward off balance and looked to the sheriff for what to do. It never landed. Ezra didn't argue the law because he'd heard enough of the sheriff's reading from the back of the crowd to know there was no law in it worth arguing. He set his free hand on Aya's shoulder, light, the way a man steadies a post that's starting to lean, and he looked up at Cole Marston on the porch. 2 words was all he gave it. "She's mine," he said. Then he said the debt was his now, to put it in the book, and he'd settle it on his own land in his own time. It was a lie, and everyone in the square, including Aya, knew it was a lie. And it was also the most dangerous thing a man could say in a territory with no real court. It bound him to a debt and a woman he'd never laid eyes on, and gave the sheriff a claim on everything he owned if he broke his word. The sheriff couldn't whip a man who owned 40 acres and a rifle and wouldn't flinch, not in front of a crowd that had just watched him catch a whip barehanded. Marston's face went through surprise and came out the other side into something colder, and he wrote the debt onto Ezra Dalton's name in the same ledger, slow and deliberate, and he let them go because he was certain this rancher would break inside a month and drag her back himself. He was wrong about that. Aya didn't thank him. She got to her feet without his help, the box still pressed to her ribs, and she looked at him once with an expression he hadn't expected. He had expected fear or gratitude or the dull obedience of a rescued woman, and what he got was none of those. Something passed between them in the half-second before she turned toward the horses. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition of 2 people who'd both learned what it cost to stand alone against something bigger than them. Then she walked past him toward the ridge, and he followed, and the sheriff watched them go from the porch, with a plan already forming behind his eyes. The ride north took the rest of the daylight. The land flattened into scrub and pale rock, then climbed toward the ridge in a slow grade that hid the ranch from the road until a rider was almost on top of it. There were no neighbors for miles in any direction, no smoke from any other chimney, no sound but the horses and the wind pushing through the dry grass, and a man came to a place like this to disappear. The cabin sat at the head of a shallow valley with a corral out front and a barn half built into the slope, sparse and clean in the way that comes from a man with too much time and not enough to fill it. A single chair by the fire, a shelf of tack and tools hung in order, a bedroll against the far wall, and not one object in the room that didn't have a use. The walls told the story the man wouldn't. 3 years of keeping a place going without keeping himself going. Every chore done and nothing enjoyed. He was barely there. Aya noticed one thing before she noticed anything else. There were 2 hook pegs by the door, and only one had ever held a coat, the other worn smooth and empty in a way that said it hadn't held anything in a long time. A man didn't build a second peg for himself. She filed it away the way she filed away the things that didn't fit, without asking, because a question asked too early never gets a true answer. Aya stood in the doorway for a long moment before she stepped inside, and then she didn't ask for anything. She took the corner by the fire, set the medicine box down beside her like something she was appointed to guard, and lowered herself to the floor with her back to the wall. Her silence wasn't submission, and it wasn't shock, and anyone who watched the way she placed the box level and squared her shoulders would have known it. It was the posture of a woman who'd been thrown out of one life and was waiting to see what the next one expected of her before she gave it anything. This wasn't waiting for kindness. Ezra didn't press her. He put a blanket near her, not on her, and sat across the room with a bridle in his lap, working a stiff strap back and forth through his hands without looking up. The two of them sat like that while the light failed, two strangers learning the shape of each other through what they didn't say, the geometry of the room doing the talking the people wouldn't. She tried to sleep sitting up, the box against her hip, her body curled around it like she was still expecting someone to come take it in the night. He watched her do it for a while, then told her, flat, that no one was coming through that door tonight. She didn't answer, but somewhere in the next few minutes her shoulders dropped a half-inch and her breathing evened out, and that small surrender was the most he'd gotten from her all day. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and pressed against the walls, and the cabin held. The door stayed shut all night. Morning broke cold and clear. Ezra was up before the light, out at the corral working a gate hinge that had been threatening to give for a week, and he'd been favoring his left arm without thinking about it, the way a man does when an old wound has become part of the weather. The cold had turned the shoulder stiff overnight, and when he reached too far for a board, something inside the joint tore with a sound only he heard, and the blood came through his shirt slow and dark before he admitted it had happened. He kept working because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who'd finish the hinge before he'd look at his own damage. Aya came out with water and saw the stain spreading across his back before he saw her see it. She didn't speak. She went back inside and came out with the lacquered box open in her hands, and she set it on the corral rail and motioned him to sit on the trough. The box held a set of needles so fine they caught no light at all, laid in a groove of dark silk, and a smaller packet of dried herbs wrapped in cloth. They were tools her grandmother had used in Kyoto before Aya was born, the kind of old knowledge that crossed an ocean in a wooden box and outlived the people who carried it. Ezra watched her hands as she chose a needle, and his face did something she hadn't seen from him yet, because he'd expected something he could dismiss, a ritual, a superstition, a foreign woman's guess at medicine. He got competence instead, the clean, quick kind that doesn't need to explain itself. And he hadn't expected that. He'd expected less. She worked the needles in along the shoulder in a pattern he couldn't follow, shallow and precise, each one placed like it had a specific address. Then she crushed the herbs into a paste with water and laid it over the worst of the swelling, and the smell rose up, green and sharp, and nothing like anything that grew on this ridge. He felt the heat go out of the joint before she told him it would, the pain draining like water off a flat stone, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His shoulder went quiet. He asked her, gruff, if it was some kind of magic. She said no, just old. And the word old landed different for both of them, heavier than two letters should be, because he'd been carrying something old of his own for 3 years, and he recognized the weight when he saw it in someone else's hands. She refused payment when he offered it, and he insisted, and she told him the debt between them wasn't hers to keep. That was the first crack in the 3 years of quiet he'd built around himself, and he didn't know yet whether to let it widen or patch it shut. For 3 days after that, a small rhythm started without either of them naming it. She treated the shoulder morning and evening, and he left the cabin to her when she needed the quiet. And they ate meals across the fire from each other in something that wasn't yet comfort, but had stopped being wariness. He caught himself watching her hands at the corral, the way she calmed a skittish colt by standing still and letting it come to her. And he understood that the needles weren't the only old things she'd brought with her. She carried a whole way of moving through the world, slow and deliberate, the kind of calm a frontier horse would follow before it would follow a man shouting at it. And the ridge felt less empty for the first time in years. The quiet had settled between them like something they'd earned, and neither of them noticed yet that it was the kind of quiet a man borrows right before the debt comes due. Something had started. The rider came on the fourth morning, a young deputy with a folded paper and the smug look of a man delivering bad news on someone else's authority. He handed it to Ezra at the gate and didn't dismount. A warrant, filed proper in the territorial record, stating that Ezra Dalton harbored a debtor and had assumed a debt he now refused to pay, and that the widow's late husband's lease and the small stock and land it covered were forfeit to cover costs. The sum had grown again since the square, fattened with storage fees and interest, and a charge for the deputy's time in delivering the paper. And it was legal in the way things are legal in a town where the sheriff is the only law, and the only judge is 3 weeks' ride away. Ezra rode into Salt Wells that same afternoon to settle it the way a man is supposed to settle things. He brought an offer of cattle, 5 head, more than the original debt by any honest count, and he laid it out in front of the mercantile where the crowd could hear. The sheriff refused it, named a higher figure, then a higher one, then claimed the land lease was forfeit regardless of payment because the debt had been transferred, and transfers carried penalty. Every move Ezra made, the sheriff raised, and the ledger moved with him, the numbers bending to fit whatever Marston needed them to fit. The numbers always bent his way. The town did what it had done in the square. The storekeeper wouldn't sell to him, not grain, not powder, not a length of rope, and the farrier turned him away with an excuse about a full schedule. Men who'd watched him catch a whip 4 days ago watched him get refused in broad daylight and studied their boots, and the complicity was the same as before, shown in small actions and averted eyes. It stung worse now, because he'd thought his name and his land would carry weight, and they carried none. What carried weight in Salt Wells was the ledger, and the ledger had Marston's handwriting in it, and no one else's. Aya had told him not to go. She'd said it once, the morning he saddled up, quiet, the way she said most things. And he went anyway, because he'd believed for 3 years that the law was a thing a man could stand inside if he kept his hands clean. He had to learn in person that Marston owned the law the way he owned the ledger. He came back to the ranch empty-handed and colder than she'd seen him. The anger turned inward, where it does the most damage, because the failure wasn't the sheriff's cruelty, but his own faith in a system that had never been honest. She was waiting by the fire when he walked in, and she didn't ask how it went. She told him, quiet, that the law was never the point, that the debt was a leash, meant to be pulled until he handed her back. He heard it, and this time he understood it in his body, and not just his head, the way a man understands a wound once it starts bleeding. He'd believed in the law. Aya asked to see Kenji's things, whatever the sheriff had left behind. Ezra rode back down the next morning before the town was awake, and collected the trunk the mercantile had been holding, a small wooden box of a man's whole life reduced to what wouldn't sell. He brought it up the ridge and set it on the cabin floor, and she knelt over it, the way she'd knelt in the square, only this time what she held was something the sheriff hadn't wanted her to find. Inside were a few letters, a household ledger in Kenji's careful hand, and a stack of receipts bound with twine. She read the ledger first, page by page, and the numbers didn't match. Kenji had paid the mercantile twice over in the year before he died, once in cash and once in labor mending the store's back wall, and he'd noted every payment with the date and the witness's name. The debt Marston had read out in the square was built on top of a debt that had already been settled, and the receipts in the trunk proved it. The leash was never about money, and it had been about the land lease and the small practice Kenji had started, and the woman left holding both. She kept reading, and the worst part came slow. In the margin of one page, in Kenji's hand, was another man's name, a homesteader named Pruitt, who'd owed Marston 2 years before, and lost 40 acres the same way, debt inflated, law bent, land seized. Below it a second name, a miner called Voss, gone the same route the next spring. Kenji had written them down because he'd seen the pattern and worried he was next, and he'd been right, and the worry had been the last clear thing he'd put on paper. Aya didn't say what she was thinking. She sat with the ledger open across her knees, and her face the same stillness it had worn in the square, but her hands had gone white at the knuckles. The implication was there for anyone who followed the numbers, that Kenji hadn't just sickened and died in a strange town, but that his death had been convenient for the man who wanted his lease, and that the same sheriff who read out the debt had presided over a death that fit his needs. The truth sat in the room like a third person, held the way she held the needles, ready to use when the moment was right and not a second before. She had what she needed, and the sheriff didn't know she had it, and that gap between what she knew and what he thought she knew was the only weapon left to her. That night, the sheriff's men rode out to the ridge. They didn't come for a fight, because a fight would leave marks a town could ask about, and they came for the barn instead. Ezra woke to the smell of smoke and was out the door before his boots were laced, and Aya was a step behind him with a wet sack in her hands. The barn was going fast, the dry hay catching like kindling, and the horses were screaming in the corral with the fence already split and the stock scattering into the dark. They beat the fire down with sacks and dirt and the last of the trough water, and they saved the structure, but lost the hay and a season's feed. And the message was written plain in the charred wood: give her back or lose everything. Aya pulled a burned plank out of the embers with her bare hand and didn't make a sound, and Ezra saw the red rise up across her palm and saw her set the plank down and keep working like it hadn't happened. He understood then that she'd been living inside this kind of cost since before he met her, and that the barn was only new to him. She'd burned her whole life. They sat on the porch steps in the dark after the fire, breathing the smoke out of their lungs, the barn a black shape against the ridge, and the smell of it thick in the air. Neither of them spoke for a long time, because there wasn't anything to say that the fire hadn't already said louder. The night was quiet in the way a town is quiet after a beating, the quiet of a thing finished and the cost still being counted. The fire had said enough. Aya tried to leave before dawn. She packed the medicine box in the cold dark, wrapped the burned hand in a clean rag, and started down the road toward Salt Wells, meaning to hand herself over so the ranch would stop burning. She believed she was the cause, that the debt reached through her and pulled on everyone near her, and that the only way to stop the pull was to walk back into the hand that held the other end. She'd made it a quarter mile when Ezra caught up to her on foot, bareheaded, no rifle, just a man who'd heard the door and followed. He didn't make a speech. He took the box out of her hands, gentle but final, the way a man takes something from someone who's handing over the wrong thing, and he walked it back to the cabin and set it inside the door. Then he stood in the doorway and told her, flat, that he hadn't stopped a whipping to watch her deliver herself to the man who'd lit his barn. One action and one sentence rearranged the choice between them in the space it took to say it. For the first time since she'd arrived on the ridge, the wall came down. Not all the way, and not into anything she'd have called trust, but the careful distance she'd kept since the square cracked enough to let a real thing through. It wasn't love, not even trust, but a recognition of two people who'd both learned what it cost to stand alone, choosing not to this once. She went back inside, and he built the fire up, and they sat with the warmth between them and the dark outside. The dark did the rest. She told him one true thing about Kinji, that he'd crossed an ocean believing a man's word meant something out here, that he'd wanted to build a place where his medicine mattered and his family could stand straight. Ezra told her one true thing back, the reason he'd gone quiet 3 years ago, that he'd watched Marston do this same thing to the Pruitt family and said nothing, and that the not saying had been eating him ever since. The open loop closed into a reason, and the reason was a man trying to pay back a silence he couldn't undo. He'd carried it for 3 years. She treated his shoulder again that night, slower than it needed, the needles placed in the quiet while the fire burned low. The intimacy was in the silence and not in any words, and neither of them named what was starting to form between them, because naming it would have made it something they'd have to defend. Names would have ruined it. They ride into Salt Wells in the morning light, side by side, in the open, with the ledger in Aya's hands and the sun behind them. The square is already full, because word travels fast in a small town, and a rancher who catches whips doesn't ride in quiet. Sheriff Marston stands on the mercantile porch with his 2 deputies behind him, and his hand rests on the ledger he's been writing in for 6 years. This time, she had proof. Aya doesn't raise her voice. She walks to the center of the square and lays Kinji's pages out flat on the boards where everyone can see. The receipts fanned beside them, the margin names facing up. The numbers come out in the same calm voice she used to ask for the ledger the day of the whipping, only now there's no whip in the air and no one to refuse her. She reads Kinji's payments, the dates, the witnesses, and then she reads the figures Marston invented on top of a debt that was already paid. And she does it the way she places a needle, slow and precise, in a language anyone in the square can follow. Marston tries to laugh it off. He calls it a foreign woman's confusion, a widow who can't read her own husband's papers, and he reaches for the pages to take them off the boards. Ezra steps between her hand and the sheriff's reach, not with a gun drawn, but with his body and his name, and he tells the crowd the other 2 names in the margin, Pruitt and Voss, and the 40 acres each of them lost to the same ledger. He says he knew about Pruitt and said nothing, and that the nothing is on him, and that he's saying it now out loud because it should have been said 3 years ago. The saying cost him something he doesn't show. The town turns, not all at once, the way a wall gives way brick by brick. The farrier remembers the Pruitt family and the wagon they left on, and the storekeeper's wife steps forward and looks at the receipts and doesn't look away. A ranch hand who works for Marston sets his rifle down against the porch post and walks off the porch, and the walking is louder than anything anyone said all morning. Complicity breaks the way it formed, in small actions, the boots that stop shifting, the heads that stop turning, the coin that stops being counted. Coin stopped changing hands. Marston sees it going and does what a man does when the lie stops holding. He draws. The deputy nearest Aya moves on her, and Ezra takes the weight of the man with his shoulder, the same shoulder she's been treating all week. And a shot goes wide into the dust and kicks up a plume of white. Aya doesn't flinch, because she's already accepted the worst. The same calm that terrified the crowd in the square the first day. And now that calm does the opposite of what it did before. Now it steadies the whole square, because a woman who won't flinch at a gunshot makes the man who fired it look small. The sheriff is undone, not by a gun, but by his own ledger and a town that stops looking at its boots. They take his star off his chest in the dirt, and it's messy, hands shaking. No judge to make it official, no court to record it. Just people deciding the lie is over and acting like it. No judge came to record it. Marston ends up on the ground with his deputies gone and his star in the dust, And the crowd stands over him the way crowds stand over something they're not proud of, but couldn't keep carrying. The storekeeper steps forward then and does the thing he'd refused to do 4 days ago. He looks Ezra in the face and tells him the grain and the rope and the powder are his whenever he wants them, no charge, and that the farrier will shoe his horses by sundown. It's not courage. It's a man reading the room and choosing the side that's going to be left standing. And Ezra takes the offer without thanking him, because the thanks would be more than the man earned. The square starts to empty the way it filled, slow, each person walking off with the weight of what they'd watched and what they'd finally stopped watching. People were picking their side. In the quiet after, Aya asks the question one time. She asks how Kenji died. The sheriff says nothing, and the silence is the answer, and it's the only one she's going to get. No confession comes, no trial, no kind of justice that comes with a verdict and a record. She gets the truth in the absence of words, and she stands with it the way she stood with the box in the square, holding it level and not letting it drop. The aftermath came in slower sentences and a longer breath. Ezra's shoulder had taken the deputy's weight wrong, and the old wound opened fresh, real this time but not fatal. Aya treated it that evening with the same needles and the same box and the same hands that had started the whole alliance on the corral rail a week before, and the loop of her skill closed back to where it began, only now it was chosen and not bargained, and the choosing was the difference. They'd lost the barn and the hay and a season's income, and Ezra had lost the 3 years of hiding he'd built around himself like a second cabin. The town had lost the easy story that the sheriff kept them safe, the lie that let them look away while he fed on the people without a name or a rifle to push back. Aya hadn't gotten a body to bury properly, or a clear answer about Kenji's last hours, and she wasn't going to get one, because the frontier doesn't hand out the kind of justice that comes with a court and a verdict. It hands a person the next morning and asks what they'll make of it. The moral weight sat on both of them, and neither tried to lift it with a speech. Ezra looked at the star lying in the dust of the square before they rode home and didn't feel clean, and Aya looked at the empty mercantile porch and didn't feel avenged. Honor satisfied and honor hollow are not the same thing, and a week of standing up had given them the first and left them holding the second. Both of them knew it. She could have left then, because the debt was gone, the town was broken, and the road was open in every direction. She stayed. Not because of Ezra, not yet, maybe not ever, but because Kenji had started something in Salt Wells. A small practice, a place where his medicine had begun to matter, and she wasn't going to let Marston's ghost take that too. The dignity was in the staying, the way it had been in the kneeling, only now it was standing, and standing was the harder of the two. He asked her that night if she needed anything. She said a door that locks and a town that remembers, and he said he could manage one of those. The dry wit landed flat, with no winking at anyone, and it was the first time either of them had sounded like they might survive this with a sense of humor intact. Aya sat on the mercantile porch a week later, with the medicine box open beside her and a line of townspeople waiting to be seen, the lacquered wood catching the morning light the way it had caught the firelight in a cabin on a ridge. The frontier hadn't become fair. It had just gotten one woman who refused to kneel and one man who refused to look away. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.